They say a janitor is just someone who sweeps away the dust others leave behind. But no one ever asked what dreams got buried beneath that dust. It was still dark when Mary Jackson unlocked the back door of Lincoln High School. The cold morning air wrapped around her thin jacket, making each breath sharp like tiny needles against her chest. She moved quietly through the silent hallways, her old mop bucket squeaking on the polished floor, echoing in the empty corridors like a lonely hymn. Mary had learned to become invisible. The students didn't see her, the teachers barely nodded. Her reflection in the windows looked like a fading ghost, gray hair, tired eyes, hands cracked from endless scrubbing. But inside, a fire she thought had long died still pulsed quietly. Every night, after wiping chalk dust and emptying trash, she would pause by the math classroom. Her eyes would lock onto the blackboard filled with complex symbols, equations that once lived in her blood like a second language. She would stand there, gripping her mop handle tighter than necessary, feeling the tremor run through her fingers. Memories flooded back: Columbia University, the lecture halls, the whispered insults, the weight of her father's accident, the day she walked away from her dream. Some nights, when the school was empty and only the moonlight spilled across the classroom, she would pick up a piece of chalk left behind. Her hand would hover above the board, shaking, before she slowly drew out solutions in the air, never daring to write them down. She had convinced herself she was just a janitor now, nothing more. But sometimes, when no one was watching, she whispered to the silent walls, What if I hadn't stopped?" This morning felt different. As she stood in front of that familiar board, her breath turned shallow, her heart echoing like a war drum in her chest. In the quiet, she could almost hear the laughter that had haunted her for decades, the voices telling her she would never be enough. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool blackboard, a silent prayer rising in her mind. What if today wasn't just another day of silence? What if, for once, the world had to see her, not as a janitor, but as the woman she was always meant to be? They say you can measure a person's worth by the echoes they leave behind. But for Mary Jackson, the hallways of Lincoln High had only ever echoed with her silence. Long before sunrise, she unlocked the side door and stepped inside, the weight of her keys heavy against her hip. Her footsteps blended into the hum of the old fluorescent lights above. The scent of floor cleaner and stale chalk clung to her clothes like an old ghost. Mary moved through the corridors, her mop bucket rattling softly. The school trophies glinted under the dim lights, shining with pride and victory, honors that never had her name. Each morning felt the same. Students would rush past her, some too busy laughing to notice the older woman who bent to pick up stray papers. Others would glance, smirk, then keep moving as if she were a stain on the floor they stepped over. Mary would nod politely when teachers passed her by, but the nods were often returned with tight, practiced smiles or distracted stares into phones. In this building of bright futures, she was just background noise. When she reached the math classroom, she paused. Her eyes traced the messy white lines left from yesterday's equations. The symbols felt like old friends calling to her from a life she had buried long ago. She wiped the board slowly, carefully, almost reverently. With each motion, her breath slowed, her chest tightened. She imagined the letters and numbers dancing in her mind, alive again for a moment before she erased them. In the reflection of the window, she saw her own face, skin-lined and weary, hair touched with silver, eyes that once held stars but now only carried quiet. She remembered the lectures at Columbia, the professors praising her quick mind, the jealous whispers in the dorm halls. She remembered her father's accident, the sudden collapse of dreams, the unspoken promise to herself that she would never let anyone see her break. Mary pressed a hand against the cool window pane. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky, soft and pink like a fragile hope. Somewhere deep inside, she still heard that voice, soft but steady, the one that used to say, "You are more than what they see." She turned away from the window, exhaling slowly, her shoulders heavy yet unwilling to collapse. As she gathered her mop and bucket, a student's laughter echoed down the hallway. A sharp, careless laugh that stung more than any insult spoken aloud. Mary's fingers tightened around the mop handle. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her heart pounding against her ribs as if begging to break free. She looked back at the math classroom one last time that morning, a silent goodbye caught at the back of her throat. Then she continued down the hallway, footsteps echoing softly behind her, each one a quiet testament to the battles no one else could see. The first time Mary Jackson stepped onto Columbia University's campus, she felt like she had finally stepped into the future she had always imagined. The grand stone buildings, the sprawling green lawns, the buzz of young minds exchanging ideas. It felt like a symphony written just for her. She had been one of the few Black students accepted into the mathematics program. She carried her books close to her chest as if afraid someone might steal them, or worse, tell her she didn't deserve them. She remembered late nights in the library, the smell of old pages mixing with her excitement. Equations flowed through her mind like gentle rivers, each problem a puzzle she was born to solve. But even in that haven of learning, shadows lingered. She found hateful notes slipped under her dorm door. Whispers in the cafeteria turned sharp when she walked by. "She doesn't belong here," they would say, loud enough for her to hear. She remembered the day her father called, the tremor in his voice as he told her about the accident at the factory, the medical bills stacking higher than the textbooks she adored. Mary stood under the heavy oak tree on campus that evening, her acceptance letter folded and refolded in her pocket, her dreams wrinkling along with it. She tried to imagine a way forward, but in the end, family always came first. On her last day, she paused at the mathematics building's entrance, running her fingers along the cold stone. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to the doorway, "I'll be back." But life moved faster than promises. Days turned into years, jobs came and went. She learned to trade chalk for a broom, lectures for silence, and classrooms for endless hallways. Yet the equations never truly left her. Late at night, she would scribble numbers on scrap papers or old napkins in her small kitchen, her fingers aching to feel the chalk again. She kept a small, folded piece of paper hidden in an old recipe book, the legendary problem from her Columbia days. The problem no one had solved back then, a symbol of everything she had lost and everything she still carried inside. Sometimes she would take it out, trace the symbols slowly, her breath trembling. Her mind would leap forward, whispering solutions she never dared to write down. "What if I hadn't stopped?" she would ask the empty room, her voice so soft it barely echoed off the cracked walls. What if she had stayed? What if she had fought harder? In those moments, the woman she might have been rose from the ashes, staring back at her in the dim kitchen light. But before the dream could fully breathe, reality always returned. Bills needed paying, floors needed scrubbing. Still, the question echoed louder each year, growing roots in the quiet corners of her soul. What if she dared, just once more? The hallway felt colder that morning. Mary could sense it even before she entered the math classroom. The usual laughter and careless chatter seemed sharper, like tiny knives slicing the air. She bent down to pick up a crumpled piece of paper near the doorway. Her fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed it out, her eyes tracing over meaningless scribbles. Mr. Charles Anderson leaned against his desk, his arms crossed, his gaze locked onto her like a hunter eyeing fragile prey. His eyes glittered with a cruel amusement that sent a shiver crawling up Mary's spine. "Mrs. Jackson," he called, his voice slicing through the room. The students turned, their faces already curling into smirks and poorly hidden grins. Mary froze, the paper still clutched in her hand. Her heart thudded so loudly she was sure they could hear it. Mr. Anderson tilted his head slightly, his smile tight and sharp. "You've been listening to my lessons all these years, haven't you? Maybe you'd like to show us your mathematical skills today." A wave of laughter burst from the students, echoing around her like a crashing tide. A few students slapped their desks, others leaned over to whisper, their words coated in poison. Mary felt her throat tighten. Her feet refused to move. Her fingers dug into the paper, crumpling it again, her nails pressing crescent moons into her palms. Mr. Anderson pushed away from his desk, stepping closer. "Come on now, don't be shy. You think you can handle this problem, right? Maybe you've been waiting for your moment to shine all along." He pointed toward the blackboard, where a complicated equation stretched across in harsh white chalk, mocking her with every curve and angle. Mary felt every pair of eyes pinning her to the floor. Whispers turned into open taunts. She probably doesn't even know what those symbols mean. Look at her. She's terrified. She looked up at Mr. Anderson, silently begging for mercy, for an escape, for a sliver of kindness in his gaze. But his eyes only sparkled with dark delight, feeding off her humiliation. Her chest heaved, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Memories slammed into her, the notes on her dorm door, the cold stares, the day she walked away from everything she loved. Mary closed her eyes. In that darkness, she saw the equations that had once been her lifeline, her solace, her proof that she was more than what the world decided she was. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes again. The room was dead silent now, holding its breath, waiting for her to crumble. But something shifted inside her, like a door creaking open after years sealed shut. Her fingers uncurled. She dropped the crumpled paper to the floor. She straightened her spine, her shoulders rising as if pulled by an invisible force, the quiet strength she had buried clawing its way back to the surface. Without a word, Mary stepped forward. Each footstep sounded like a drumbeat in her ears, strong and certain. She reached for the piece of chalk. It felt cold, almost foreign in her hand. But as her fingers curled around it, an old, fierce warmth began to rise inside her. Behind her, the class shifted uncomfortably, their giggles dying in their throats, replaced by an electric, nervous tension. Mr. Anderson's smirk faltered for the first time. Mary drew in a slow breath, her chest rising like a tide under a full moon. Then she lifted the chalk to the board. The first stroke of chalk hit the board like a single drumbeat echoing through an empty canyon. A sharp, crisp sound that sliced the silence open and made every student in the room flinch. Mary's hand moved slowly at first, shaky but determined, each line forming with careful intention. The numbers and symbols, long hidden inside her, started to pour out, weaving together like threads in an old tapestry she thought had been lost forever. Mr. Anderson stood frozen near his desk, his arms dropping to his sides. His eyes darted between Mary's hand and the growing maze of equations on the board, his confidence draining away with every new mark. The students watched, eyes wide, mouths ajar. No one dared to whisper now. The air was thick, electric, almost alive, like a storm waiting to break. Mary felt her breath steady, her heartbeat shifting from frantic to focused. Each equation flowed into the next as if her mind had never forgotten, as if each silent year had only been a rehearsal for this exact moment. The chalk glided faster, her fingers guiding it with a certainty that stunned even her. Thoughts she had locked away decades ago returned, sharp and clear, clicking together in her mind like pieces of an intricate puzzle. A boy in the second row leaned forward, his eyes flicking between the board and Mary's face, his expression shifting from ridicule to awe. A girl clutched her pencil so tightly it snapped, but she didn't notice, her attention chained to Mary's every movement. Mr. Anderson took a step forward, his mouth opening as if to interrupt, but no words came out. His voice, once so loud and commanding, now trapped somewhere deep inside his chest. Mary's breathing deepened, her shoulders rolling back as she finished each line, her body remembering the rhythm of lectures she never got to give, the elegant dance of logic she never got to perform. She paused for a moment, studying the board, her head tilting slightly, as if listening to an old friend whispering in her ear. Then she began writing again, this time faster, more confident, the chalk moving in strong, sweeping motions. The room felt smaller with every stroke, as if all the walls and desks were collapsing inward, leaving only Mary and the truth she was finally, fearlessly revealing. A sudden gasp escaped from the back row. Another student buried their face in their hands, unable to look away. Mary felt heat rise through her chest, an old fire roaring back to life, burning away the years of silence and shame. She could almost hear her younger self cheering, urging her forward. As she neared the final line, the chalk clicked softly against the board. She let it linger for a heartbeat, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear now, but from the weight of release. Then, with one last deliberate motion, she drew the closing symbol, Mary set the chalk down gently on the tray, the sound echoing louder than any shout. She turned to face the room. Her eyes found Mr. Anderson first. His face was pale, his lips parted, his pride shattered and scattered at his feet. She took a single step forward, her gaze sweeping across every student. Their faces were frozen between disbelief and reverence, all illusions of superiority crumbling silently. Mary inhaled deeply, her voice low but steady, carrying the force of every dream she had ever buried. This is the solution you wanted. And in that moment, she wasn't the janitor, the ghost, or the background noise. She was the storm they never saw coming. For a long moment, the room felt as if it had slipped out of time, suspended in a breath no one dared to release. Mary stood before them, her chest rising and falling slowly, the weight of decades finally sliding off her shoulders. A pencil rolled off a desk and clattered onto the floor, the sharp sound snapping the room awake. Gasps rose first, then whispers like a tide creeping in. Oh my God, she did it. That's impossible, she solved it. She was right here all along. A girl in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Her breath came in tiny, shaky waves as if her world had just shifted beneath her feet. A boy who had mocked Mary the loudest now sat slumped forward, his face buried in his palms. His shoulders shook, whether in shame or disbelief, no one could tell. Mr. Anderson looked as though the ground had vanished beneath him. His jaw trembled. His fingers twitched uselessly at his sides. His entire posture crumbled, revealing the fragile shell behind his arrogance. Mary's eyes swept across the room, meeting each student, one by one. Their gazes darted away, unable to hold the quiet power radiating from her. She turned slightly toward the board, her fingertips hovering near the final line she had written. Her expression softened, as if greeting an old friend she had long mourned. Silence swallowed the room again, but this time it was thick with reverence, not scorn. Finally, a lone voice broke through from the middle row, a small, hesitant whisper, trembling in the heavy air. We were so wrong about her. The words rippled through the class like a shiver, each student feeling the truth seep into their bones. Heads lowered, eyes turned to the floor, hearts cracked open in ways none of them had expected when they walked into class that morning. Mary turned away from the board and began to walk toward the door. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of defiance and freedom. Students parted before her, the once mocking sea now a quiet passage of respect and shock. She paused briefly at the threshold, her hand resting on the doorframe. She glanced back, not in anger, but with a calm that glowed brighter than any revenge. Mr. Anderson tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound emerged. He looked at Mary with wide, hollow eyes, the final pieces of his pride crumbling silently to the floor. Mary offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of forgiveness, but of finality. Then she stepped out into the hallway, her figure disappearing into the quiet. Behind her, the class remained frozen, each student trapped in the echo of her unspoken lesson. It wasn't just the problem on the board she had solved. She had shattered the illusions they clung to, the prejudice they carried like hidden scars. And in that stunned silence, every single one of them knew they would never look at her, or themselves, the same way again. The story of what happened in Mr. Anderson's classroom spread through Lincoln high faster than wildfire. By the end of that day, it wasn't just a rumor whispered between desks. It was a force moving through every hallway, every locker, every quiet corner that once ignored her presence. Students huddled together between classes, eyes wide, voices low but urgent. Did you see her? She solved it like it was nothing. I never even knew she could do math at all, let alone that. She's not just a janitor, she's a genius. Mary walked down those same halls, her mop bucket in hand, but everything felt different now. Instead of turned backs and careless sneers, eyes followed her with hesitant curiosity, awe, and something that almost looked like guilt. A group of students stepped aside to let her pass. One girl lowered her gaze and murmured a soft, "Good morning, Ms. Jackson." The words trembled, as though they were learning to walk for the first time. Mary gave her a gentle nod, her face calm, her heart beating in quiet waves of disbelief and cautious relief. Mr. Anderson stayed locked inside his classroom for most of the day. He avoided the teacher's lounge, skipped lunch, and stared at the chalkboard as if it had turned into a mirror he could no longer look away from. At the far end of the hallway, Emily Carter stood with her books pressed tightly to her chest. She had been one of the brightest students, always quick to laugh at others' mistakes, always ready with a biting comment. But now her sharp eyes were soft, clouded with something heavy and raw. Emily watched Mary move through the hall, the mop handle gripped like a quiet sword of dignity. Guilt clawed at Emily's throat, making her breath short and uneven. How could we have been so blind? She whispered to Jake Miller beside her. Jake didn't answer, just stared at Mary with wide, haunted eyes, his knuckles white around his backpack strap. The teachers, too, began to shift in small, awkward ways. Whispers turned into worried glances, polite smiles into thoughtful silences. In the faculty lounge, Anna Smith, the English teacher, shook her head slowly, her voice low and tinged with shame. We spend our days teaching them about respect and equality, but we let it die right in front of us. And she carried all that alone. By the afternoon, even the principal, Robert Williams, had heard every detail. He sat alone in his office, staring out the window as clouds drifted across the sky, each passing moment feeling heavier than the last. Finally, he stood, ran a shaking hand through his hair, and stepped into the hallway. The soft hum of students talking fell into silence as he passed. He spotted Mary in the distance, wiping down a glass trophy case. Her movements were slow, almost meditative, her reflection shimmering in the glass like a ghost from another life. Principal Williams hesitated. His throat tightened, words jamming against each other before they could find a way out. He took a step forward, then another, each one echoing through the hushed corridor like the toll of a distant bell. When he finally reached her, he stopped a few feet away. Mary continued working, not turning around. MS. Jackson, he called gently, his voice thin but earnest. Mary paused, her hand resting on the cloth, her back still to him. For a heartbeat, the hallway seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would turn or walk away. She lowered the cloth, then slowly straightened her spine. Her head tilted just slightly, listening. Principal Williams swallowed hard, his fingers fidgeted at his sides. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked, the words shaky, each syllable heavy with something deeper than authority. Mary stayed still for a long moment, then nodded once, the movement graceful and quiet. She turned to face him at last, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. In that instant, Principal Williams felt something inside him shift, as if he were standing at the edge of a truth he had ignored for too long. And with that silent agreement, they both understood. Nothing at Lincoln High would ever be the same again. The janitor's closet had always been Mary's small sanctuary. The scent of bleach and old paper towels, the hush of the narrow space, the soft clink of bottles lining the shelves, it was her quiet world, hidden away from the sharp edges of the school outside. She stood inside now, arranging supplies in careful lines. Each motion slow and steady, each breath long and controlled, as though she were anchoring herself to the ground beneath her feet. A soft knock broke the silence. Mary didn't turn. She knew that knock wasn't from a student coming to mock her or a teacher needing a quick cleanup. She felt the weight of that hesitation behind the door. "MS. Jackson, Mr." Anderson's voice called, trembling on the edge of something raw. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then placed the last spray bottle down and turned slowly. Mr. Anderson stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept since the morning before. His hands hung useless at his sides, fingers twitching like they were reaching for words he didn't know how to hold. For a long second, neither of them moved. The air between them felt thick, charged with unspoken years. He started, then stopped, his throat working around the words like broken glass. Mary tilted her head slightly, waiting. Her eyes were steady, but beneath that calm surface, a storm of old wounds and tired resolve swirled. Mr. Anderson took a careful step forward, the floor creaking beneath his polished shoes. "I came to apologize," he finally managed, each word forced from his chest like a confession. "What I did in that classroom, it was cruel, it was beneath me, I'm so sorry. Silence stretched out, heavy and almost suffocating. Mary watched him, her gaze unwavering, her hands folding gently in front of her apron. He struggled to meet her eyes, shifting under the weight of his own shame. "I thought I was teaching them strength and discipline," he said, his voice breaking. "But I was feeding them arrogance and my own prejudice. I saw you only as a janitor. I never even thought to look beyond." Mary took a quiet breath, her chest rising slowly. Her voice, when it came, was soft but carried the power of 1,000 unspoken nights. "You didn't just fail me," she said, her words cutting through the small room like a blade softened by sorrow. "You failed them. You taught them to look down, to judge without knowing, to measure worth by what they see, not who someone is." Mr. Anderson's face crumpled, a single tear sliding down his cheek. He looked smaller now, stripped of all the armor he had built around himself for years. Mary's eyes softened, though they held no pity, only a quiet, unyielding truth. "I carried that silence for decades," she continued, her voice steady as a steady tide. "Hiding, shrinking, swallowing my own light because the world told me I wasn't worthy of it." Mr. Anderson's shoulders shook. He pressed a hand against the doorframe as though to keep himself from collapsing. "So sorry," he whispered again, the words falling to the floor like fragile glass. Mary took a step closer, her presence gentle but immovable. "Your apology," she said, her voice a low hum of both forgiveness and finality, "is not for me. It's for your own soul. You'll carry this lesson longer than I ever carried my shame." She held his gaze, her eyes deep pools of loss and unbreakable dignity. Mr. Anderson nodded shakily, his breath ragged, his face wet with regret. In that small room, among bleach bottles and mop handles, he had finally been reduced to what he had always feared, simply human, painfully flawed. Mary stepped back, her hands returning to her side. She turned to her cleaning supplies once more, her movements smooth and unhurried. Mr. Anderson watched her for a moment longer, then lowered his head, turned, and slipped away, leaving the door ajar behind him. As the echo of his steps faded, Mary stood still, her fingers brushing lightly over a spray bottle as though it were a forgotten instrument. She breathed in slowly, deeply, feeling the old wounds inside her shift and loosen. For the first time in years, the closet didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place she had finally claimed as her own. Principal Robert Williams stood outside the janitor's closet longer than he meant to. His hand hovered near the door, his breath caught in his throat. The hallway was quiet, each second stretching into something heavy and expectant. When he finally knocked, it was soft, almost apologetic. Mary opened the door, her face calm, her eyes a calm sea that somehow felt deeper than any words he had rehearsed in his office. "Ms. Jackson," he started, his voice cracking around her name. "May I speak with you for a moment?" She nodded once and stepped aside, allowing him into the cramped room. He ducked slightly, as if the mops and cleaning supplies demanded a kind of reverence he had never given them before. He took a breath, his hands clasping and unclasping as he searched for the right words. "I want to say first that I failed you," he said, his words falling heavily in the narrow space. "I prided myself on creating an inclusive, respectful environment here, but I was blind to the quiet walls we built around you." Mary listened silently, her eyes steady, her hands resting lightly against a shelf. He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between her face and the floor. "But I don't just want to apologize," he continued, his voice gaining strength, trembling with urgency. "I want to make things right in a real, lasting way." He drew a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out with both hands as if offering a fragile gift. "I would like to invite you to join our mathematics department as a part-time instructor," he said. "Your knowledge, your story, your strength, they can teach these students more than any textbook ever could." The room felt smaller, the air dense. Mary didn't reach for the paper. Her gaze drifted past it, her eyes growing distant, as if she were peering down a long hallway of old dreams. "I know this is sudden," he added quickly, sensing her hesitation. "But I believe this is the least we can do to honor your true self. You deserve that." Mary took a long, deep breath. Her chest rose and fell slowly, as if she were gathering every piece of her life in that single motion. "Mr. Williams," she finally said, her voice soft but filled with an unshakable clarity. I appreciate your offer, more than you might ever understand. She paused, the corners of her mouth curling slightly, a gentle sadness flickering in her eyes. But I don't need a title or a classroom to prove who I am, she continued. I spent so many years believing I had to earn the right to exist beyond the mop and bucket. But now I know I never needed anyone's permission to be me. The principal's eyes shone, his lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. I hope, Mary said, her voice now a tender embrace, that what I did in that classroom showed them, and that worth isn't defined by a title or a position. It's defined by how we carry ourselves, by how we treat others, and by how deeply we dare to believe in ourselves. A tear slipped down the principal's cheek. He lowered the paper, his shoulders slumping under a burden he hadn't realized he carried. Mary stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on his arm for just a moment. It was enough. If there's a lesson to leave behind, she said, her voice as soft as dawn, it's that we all have a light. Mine doesn't need a podium to shine. The principal nodded, his throat tight, his breath shallow. Mary gave him one last, small, reassuring smile before she turned back to her shelves. He stood there, watching her, understanding at last that her quiet power was something no position could ever contain. Then he turned and stepped out of the closet, leaving the door open behind him, as if to let a new kind of light pour in. The auditorium buzzed with a nervous energy that felt almost electric. Rows of students, teachers, and parents filled every seat, their voices melting into a low hum of anticipation. On stage, the soft glow of the lights spilled across the polished floor, illuminating a single microphone standing alone, waiting. Mary stood backstage, her hands resting lightly against the curtain. Her heart thudded steadily, not in fear, but in a calm, steady rhythm, as if it had finally found its true tempo. She took one deep breath, then stepped forward, the curtain parting around her like a quiet sea. The hum in the audience dissolved into silence so deep it seemed to vibrate in the air. Mary paused at the edge of the stage, her eyes sweeping across hundreds of faces. Each gaze met hers with a mixture of guilt, wonder, and a yearning she could almost touch. She stepped up to the microphone. For a moment she simply stood there, her fingers brushing the stand lightly, her breath calm and full. I am Mary Jackson, she began, her voice low but carrying to the farthest corners of the room. Most of you have known me as the janitor who swept your halls and emptied your trash, but long before this broom, I carried dreams bigger than any hallway. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd, a collective shifting forward, breaths held. When I was young, she continued, I wanted to become a mathematician. I believed in a world that would welcome me, a world where numbers spoke louder than skin color or job titles. She paused, her gaze falling softly onto the front row of students. But life has its own lessons, she said, her voice deepening, trembling with a truth she had carried alone for decades. It taught me pain, silence, invisibility. I learned to shrink, to survive in corners no one looked at twice. But I never stopped hearing the equations whispering to me in the dark. A tear rolled down Emily Carter's cheek. Jake Miller leaned forward, his hands trembling in his lap. That day in the classroom, Mary said, her voice rising just enough to fill the room without force, wasn't about proving I was smart. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself that I had buried to make others comfortable. She paused again, her eyes shining under the lights, her shoulders square, her spine unbent. I don't need to be a teacher to teach, she continued, her voice now strong enough to echo in every heart. I don't need a title to matter. I only needed to remember who I was and to remind you that who you are cannot be defined by what the world sees on the surface. A sob broke softly somewhere in the middle rows, heads nodded, eyes filled. I stand here today, she said, her voice dropping into a gentle hush that felt like an embrace, not to ask for your respect, but to show you how to find your own, to see each other beyond the uniforms, beyond the rumors, beyond the masks we all wear to feel safe. Silence fell again, so complete it felt sacred. She looked out at them, her gaze wrapping around each soul like a warm shawl. This is the legacy I wanted to leave, she said, a final note in her voice like the closing chord of a long, unfinished song. A heartbeat passed, then another. Then the room exploded into applause. A wave of clapping, cries, and tears crashed together, rising and falling like an ocean storm under moonlight. Mary stood there a moment longer, letting it wash over her, through her, until she felt her breath steady again. Finally, she stepped back from the microphone, her eyes soft but shining with a fierce, unbreakable light. She turned, her steps quiet and sure, leaving the stage behind her, but carrying every heart in that room forward with her into something new. The morning after the assembly, Lincoln High felt different. The hallways no longer carried the sharp, biting laughter that used to echo against the walls. Instead, there was a quiet respect that hummed through every corridor like a new melody waiting to be learned. Mary arrived early, as always. She pushed her mop bucket forward, her steps steady, her eyes gentle as they traced the familiar tile floors. But this time, heads turned not away, but toward her. Students paused in small groups, watching her with wide eyes, their conversations dying on their lips. A girl in a bright yellow sweater nodded politely as Mary passed. A boy lifted his hand in a hesitant wave, his cheeks flushed pink. Mary answered them all with a soft smile, her nods small but filled with a warmth that seemed to ripple through each person she touched. In one hallway, Mr. Anderson stood beside his classroom door. He carried a stack of papers pressed to his chest, as though they might anchor him. When he saw Mary, he straightened, his eyes shining with a humility he had once thought beneath him. He dipped his head low. "Good morning, Ms. Jackson," he said, his voice steady but full of reverence. Mary held his gaze for a moment, her eyes kind and clear. Then she nodded slowly, an unspoken forgiveness glimmering like dawn light on quiet water. As she moved past, she felt the smallest flutter in her chest, like the first breath after a long, dark winter. Students began to approach her throughout the day, some shyly handing her thank you notes scribbled on torn notebook paper, others whispering timid apologies. A few simply stood nearby, silent, their eyes brimming with the beginnings of understanding. Mary accepted every word, every glance, without judgment or pride. She continued to scrub windows, polish trophies, and empty bins as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. Outside the school walls, her story spread. Parents spoke of her around dinner tables. News of the assembly reached local community centers, inspiring discussions on prejudice, respect, and unseen brilliance. Within weeks, Lincoln High introduced new workshops on inclusion and empathy. Teachers, guided by Mr. Anderson, led open conversations in classrooms. Students learned to question old beliefs, to look beyond the surface, to see each other, truly see each other, for the first time. In the quiet of the janitor's closet, Mary sometimes paused to look at her reflection in the small, scratched mirror above the sink. She no longer saw a faded outline of someone hiding in the shadows. She saw a woman standing tall, her gaze unflinching, her heart steady. At the end of each day, when the halls emptied and the lights dimmed, she would walk the length of the building slowly, her hand brushing lightly along the walls. She felt the echoes in the air, echoes of young voices learning to be kind, of old wounds beginning to heal, of her own soul finally unfolding fully, unafraid. When she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sky seemed wider, the stars brighter. Mary took a deep breath, her lips curving into a soft, private smile. "I am finally free," she whispered into the fading light, the words floating upward like a quiet hymn. Then she picked up her bucket and mop, turned toward home and walked forward, her steps gentle, certain, and utterly unbound.